So the first initial section of the thing about gender identity talks about um, how uh, it talks about, like, being how gender identity is not always consistent with birth. Like when you're born, when you're born, you're given a sex of whether you are a boy or a male or female based on your genitalia. And people whose gender identities stick with that throughout their life are considered cisgenders, and people who change are considered transgender. And notice that more people, that's just like becoming more popular across countries around the world. Or, well, I guess popular, it's becoming more noted. Um, Another thing is then going into the biological theories, and this talks about a lot of the chromosomes. I talked about how, like, chromosomes can affect your birth or affect your gender, and how having two X's makes will make a female, and an X and a Y make a male. But there's a whole lot of variability and factors that go into that, like having an extra X chromosome, having or not having an extra X chromosome, and issues with, like, an SRY gene can also lead to problems. And talks about how hormones like testosterone and androgen hormones how androgen hormones like testosterone, how those affect development. And then issues with the SRY gene can cause, like, issues in females, according to this. And then it goes on to talk about, like, brain differences, about how males' brains are typically larger than females, but females tend to have more, I think it's white matter, gray matter. It's gray matter that than males have, and this is not, like, proven science. This part is the whether this isn't, well, it's proven that typically they do, but oftentimes you won't see that you won't see that in every single male and female, that they'll have more gray matter in their brain than white matter. Then it goes into talk a lot about intersexuality and the different disorders. This takes up a lot of the reading, about how the different diagnoses of intersexuality, and how there's advocacy groups talking about wanting to change it or change the terms. But there, and it goes on, a lot of this is about how it's typically these intersexuality diagnoses and symptoms and problems and whatnot, these aren't shown at birth, but they can, like, a lot of them develop later on in life. A lot of I'm pretty sure I forget which one. Turner syndrome. 20 to 30% of those are diagnosed at birth, and but that leaves about 70 to 80% of these diagnoses that are found out later on in life. And then it talks a lot about the ethics of having surgery and trying to if it went for the ones who are diagnosed with certain gender disorders, or, well, intersexuality disorders at birth, what are the ethics of doing something about it as a child? Because there's a whole lot of things that can go wrong, there's a whole lot of things that go right, and that time frame of when you are the first few years of life is very, very crucial and important to your gender development. And with some social learning theories, it talks a lot about how fathers are typically more rough with boys, and fathers, apparently they'll try to play, like, more rough with their sons and daughters, and they give them, like, gender appropriate toys and whatnot, and things like that. And that's a big part of how people, how children are going to identify with this certain gender, from a social learning standpoint. This would be more, I feel like this kind of goes into more of, like, a nurture. Definitely is more of a nurture, because this is social learning from your parents, so rather than nature. And then after that, children vary in what gender roles that they want to play into as a child by the social cues from their parents and siblings and whatnot. But then it goes and talk about observational learning and how this can affect, like, cognitive, how the cognitive theories to for children and their sexual development and gender development. Yeah. What did I talk about that? No, there's Kohlberg's theory. Where it talks a lot about how infants are able to discriminate and tell what's the difference between a male and female, and how this observation in the first few years of life is crucial for a child's gender development, it comes from, and how it stems from a cognitive theory, and this is a cognitive theory, and I think this falls under like passive and active, or active passive child development, and and these observations are difficult for a child. It talks about one thing I think was interesting, how it said if a girl gets a buzz cut, then for a child they believe that she is a he, because girls are typically supposed to have longer hair than guys. So that's, for a child, that can be a child using cognitive, taking it from a cognitive standpoint, would struggle with that a lot. Yeah, it also said that in Kohlberg's theory, I'm pretty sure, according to Kohlberg, at about 2 to 3 years of age, that's when children figure out what their gender is. And Kohlberg also believed that it seems like he didn't believe in any sort of transgender theories and ideas. He believed that once a child understood that they're a girl or boy, it's not going to change. And he thinks that I'm pretty sure he says that any misunderstanding, I'm not really sure what the reading says on that in the book, but I'm pretty sure it has to do with how they're raised, or more from a nurture standpoint. So it also talks about how from throughout 5 to 7 years of age, children can make a lot of development in their in gender development, and there's a lot during that time frame. The gender differences, it talks about how the big thing I wanted to pick up on was the visual and the visual spatial, how guys are more advanced in development with their visual spatial differences, but another thing that was with the social person, how men are typically, although there's not many social and personal differences, men are typically more aggressive physically. And I also found it really cool that the cognitive differences, that the mean IQ scores for both male and female are 100, that the intelligence is about the same. I also found it interesting how it talks about how girls are, when they study, they're trying to prove, while guys are, when they study, are trying to improve. I think that's really interesting. It's kind of scary, honestly, I hope, because a lot of girls, I feel like that causes a lot of stress, which is what they talk about with how guys typically score better on math tests. Girls report having more anxiety with those tests, which can affect your tests greatly. So I think that's something to do with their motivation of trying to prove versus trying to improve. Trying to prove versus improving, that puts a lot more stress, I believe. And then it goes on to talk about how teaching, there's a different type of teaching and whatnot for males and females. Believes that boys can be a little bit more rowdy, I believe is what I picked up from part of it. And how the teacher bias can, from their own problems, like how a teacher teaching math is, how her own anxieties can reflect onto other students, I believe, is a big part of it. Also goes on to talk about how boys receive a lot more attention than girls do, and teachers tend to call on boys with more high-level complex questions, which is something that people should definitely get away from. Overall, I think that for some of my own interests, I think that discussing the differences, the gender differences in learning, I think is at least in the section from where it talks about how girls are trying to prove versus improve. I think that's huge, and I think it's also I would also like for my own interests and beliefs, and I think that studying the differences in why guys have more visual spatial are typically more visually spatially advanced than girls are. I think that's incredibly interesting, and I wish I knew more about that. But yeah, all right.